Hi, I'm Victoria White. I'm delighted to talk to you today about restorative practices as inclusive practices. In the work that I do in congregations around the country, I think about bringing best practices from inclusive education into our faith community setting. Inclusion. What do we mean by inclusion? Inclusion is not about one person. It's about what happens in the entire community when that person is a part of it. My late mentor, Barbara J. Newman, said this, and I think she was absolutely right. She worked in inclusive education and worked with congregations for decades. She saw this happen. We might be thinking that we're going to include an individual with disabilities in our community for their benefit. But the truth is, we are benefiting our entire community by including each person with their varied abilities. We're talking about wholeness and belonging when we talk about truly inclusive community. I think of it as a person as that last piece of a puzzle that comes in and completes the puzzle. As a faith community, we are incomplete without each one. So just as that piece out there standing alone might be lonesome and incomplete without the community around them, the opposite is also true. The community is not whole or complete without that person as a part of it. The image is incomplete, right? The community is not whole. It is not fostering belonging if we are leaving others out. So if we think about this as our inclusive practices, what are things that draw people in, that build community, that foster wholeness and foster belonging? Well, I think simply the word restorative has meaning for this conversation. And so I was drawn to restorative practices to find out, what does this have to do with inclusive community? And I began to learn that restorative practices is an approach first used when talking about repairing harm. So when harm has been done, community has been broken. And this is quite often seen in settings where discipline or punishment might usually come into play. And this is an alternative approach, not to do away with consequences, but to say, how are we approaching our system of justice and community and our reaction to what harm has been done? The restorative practices offers a slightly different approach that I want to talk about and think through, how could this transform our faith community? And is this something that is valuable as we talk about including people of varied abilities in our faith communities? Now, when harm has been done, we want to know what we can do about it, right? So this is where restorative practices has a very practical tool called the restorative question. When harm has been done, when there's been a challenging behavior, we can go to that person and say, what happened? What were you thinking about at the time? What have you thought about since? Who's been affected by what you have done? And finally, what do you think you need to do to make things right? Do you notice a question that is not on this list? Why? Why did you do that? Is so often our first question that slips out of our mouth when an incident has happened. Why did you do that? And what is most often the answer that we receive? I don't know. Look at these questions, and you notice that you will likely get to the why without asking it directly. There's also something I noticed about these questions as I looked into them. They go from the past, what happened, what are you thinking about now, into the present, and then move into the future. What do you think you need to do to make things right? What are you going to do? How are you going to move forward, right? There's an element here that is not only confronting the harm that has been done, it's saying that there is a current piece of this story, but the story is not over yet. There is more to come, and you have a choice before you in how you write the rest of that story. It's also saying that there is room to learn in this process. By asking these questions, you might be engaging someone who hasn't otherwise thought about how their actions affect their community. You could be teaching that person about their behaviors, their choices, their actions in this process. What a wonderful multi-purpose tool that addresses harm that's been done, helps to tell the story differently and give agency to this person, and also teaches this person through the process. Now, the one who has done harm is not the only one who gets a set of questions. There is a set of questions for those harmed by another's actions. We start with, what did you think when you realized what happened? What impact has the incident had on you and others? What has been the hardest thing for you? And again, what do you think needs to happen to make things right? Their answer to this question will greatly inform what actually happens in the future, whatever the answer was to the person who answered the question of what do you think you need to do to make things right for the harm they have done. This person's answer is going to be very important. And again, we're giving this person agency and acknowledging that harm has been done to them, that it's impacted them as well as others. Again, we're teaching you're not the only one harmed by this incident, right? We're acknowledging the difficulty with this by saying, what has been the hardest thing for you? Are these questions helping you to realize that maybe these would be helpful things for us to ask people with disabilities who have been harmed by our faith communities or by the actions that we have done? Something I start to think about. Now, I think about the disability community and how often we talk about shame. Restorative practices addresses shame. There's a concept they call the compass of shame that they utilize and lean into as we think about this, because shame causes a variety of reactions. And we might go into one of these directions. We might go into withdrawal when we encounter shame. We might go into avoidance when we encounter shame, or we avoid encountering the shame. We might attack ourselves. We might attack others when shame is a part of the situation. I think about how this impacts, again, the story that we're telling of a community. We'll come back to that in a little bit. But just want to notice that this is another tool in the toolbox of restorative practices that I think has impact for us. Fair process is something that I value, and I didn't notice what it was until it was identified and I learned about it through restorative practices. And then I had a situation not too long after that where I realized I was upset and feeling harmed because I wasn't given fair process. What is fair process? Fair process involves three things: engagement, explanation, and expectation clarity. The three E's. Starting with engagement, right? Gathering input from you, from stakeholders, from the people who are involved. Nothing about us without us. Explanation. What is happening here? What are the changes being made? What is the announcement? What is the information being given out? Let's be clear. Let's be explicit about what we are doing, right? And expectation clarity. Knowing what we're getting ourselves into, knowing the expected behaviors, knowing the expected outcomes. Expectation clarity is a valuable piece of the fair process that provides dignity for participants. Participating in what? Restorative practices does something called restorative circles. And this is a way of conversing that has a lot of structure built into it for some very good reasons. It's a way of gaining engagement and gathering input from those in the community. It's also a way of establishing and explaining things, and definitely comes with expectation clarity. An expectation is that one person speaks at a time, usually using a talking piece that gets passed around the circle, so that one person talks at a time. Everyone else who does not have the talking piece is listening to the one talking or signing or otherwise communicating through pictures or whatever works for that individual. Restorative circles keep everyone in a circle. There is no head of the table. There are no margins. Everyone sits in the circle as equal participants, equally represented Now, if the talking piece comes to someone who is not ready to share, they may pass. This is part of the expectation clarity that as we go around the circle, we might go in order. We might pass it to someone of our choosing. We might pass it one direction or another. The leader would establish what the expectations are for the circle before you start the circle. But any which way it is done within the circle, we follow this system so that every person has a chance. And those who pass, when the talking piece is given to them, are then at the end, before concluding that restorative circle, to be asked, would you like to share now? And if they do want to share now, the talking piece is passed back to them if they're ready to share at that time. But no one has to share, but everyone has the opportunity to share. And this avoids having one voice always heard and one voice never heard, or one perspective always represented and one perspective never represented. This creates equal opportunity for all. So this is just one example of a practical application being utilized within restorative practices. These are being utilized in restorative justice, in the criminal justice system, where instead of meting out punishments that may be even arbitrary to the harm that was done, it's instead considering what needs to be done to make things right. And that is a much higher expectation and hold someone to greater accountability than to simply doing their time or taking the punishment for something that they have done. It can be actually a lot harder work to restore what you have disrupted. So this is a huge approach happening in criminal justice, but it's also happening in education. So restorative justice in education is now becoming a buzzword. And we're seeing that educational systems are looking at this for how they do discipline with students. And so they ask the restorative questions. It doesn't mean, again, that we erase consequences for things, so that when harm has been done on the school property, it doesn't mean that a student doesn't have consequences, including expulsion or suspension or things of that nature. But it means that we're talking about how to restore community, and we're having conversations between the person harmed and the one who has done the harming, right? It means that we are thinking about community. And I think about this for our congregations, and I wonder, what would it look like to have restorative congregations? What would it look like if our faith communities were leading the way in restoring community when harm is done, instead of having the justice system or the education system hold the standards and be the forerunners? What if congregations and faith communities were the forerunners in this work? It makes me wonder how our faith could be built up and how our communities could be so much stronger if we utilized these practices and led the way for the justice system and the educational system to say, look what faith communities are doing. This is something we could also aspire to. Because what we're talking about here is community, right? We're talking about harm that has broken community, how to restore a community, how to provide everyone a chance to offer their perspective in community, to participate, to belong. Now, one thing that is happening in restorative practices is relationships, right? And so one concept that's been developed with the restorative practices approach is they call it the restorative window. And again, it's just sort of a way of describing the shape that it takes in these things. So I have here 4 boxes: not, to, for, and with. Here's what happens in relationships. If we are not engaging with people, we're ignoring, we're simply in survival mode. If we start to put some demands on that relationship without anything else as a part of it, we are doing things to someone. This can lead to blaming and stigmatizing. Many of us know what that feels like in the disability community. Demands put on us without any hope of meeting those demands. Support, however, are the other piece of the equation. So we can increase support. If we increase support in a relationship without increasing demands, we do things for people. We might be rescuing them, excusing them, reasoning, right? This could be okay to do when you go to grandma's house and she just says, eat all the cookies you want, and I don't have any rules for you to break, and then go on home. But in most contexts, we're going to need some more meat to the message, if you will, some reciprocity, some expectations put on us. That's where we get into withness. We're cooperating, collaborating, taking responsibility, and being accountable take place, because this is where demand for participation is high, but also support for participation is equally high. We are in withness with one another. Can I ask, do you want your ministry to be 2 people or 4 people or with people? So I appreciate how restorative practices has identified these ways of relating and these ways of being in leadership. What's intriguing to me is that this has been all about community building and restoring harm. But what I'm seeing happen in restorative justice in education is that it's also beginning to revolutionize how we think about delivering content. So learning new things to be done through restorative circles, learning new things without doing things to people or for people, but delivering content that engages with people. It's engaging in that fair process, right? Where those who we want to learn something new are actually engaging with that new content, who have explanation of what we're doing and why we're doing it and how we're going to go about it, and have clarity of what's expected of them within this. But delivering content so that we are truly working at transformation, not just downloading information, but transformation is happening. So as I think about these things, I think about how excited I get that what's happening in our school context can be happening in our faith communities. How is this inclusive of people of all abilities? What does this have to do with faith inclusion? I think about these things. I think it's talking here about equal seating, inviting the underrepresented perspective. There is no marginalizing when everyone sits in a circle. It's all about community, thinking about our innate need and desire for community. It's addressing shame, which is a community breaker. And it considers support as natural and equally important as demand for participation. How normal is it in your ministry to think about demand for participation being met with support for participation? So consider these things with me. How do these ideas fit with your theology? In what ways do these practices differ from the current approach you're using for ministry? And what possibilities do you now wonder about in regards to people with varied abilities in your community? I hope I have inspired some thoughts. And I pray that you have new insights because of what we're learning is happening in inclusive schools and environments all around the world that can inform how we are shaping the world and transforming communities.